Hello, everybody. So today we're going to continue in our series about God's promises, but today I wanted to just flip it over. Yesterday we talked about God being the one that makes the promise, and because he cannot lie and he's not like a human and he doesn't change his mind and he doesn't get affected by his emotions, we can trust his promises. He is integrous. He keeps his promise. He can be trusted because of who he is. But there's also another part to God's promises, and that is the people who receive his promises. So God gives promises and we receive them. But if we don't act on them, then they don't have any use to us, right? So remembering that if God makes a promise, we have to walk in that promise in order to receive it. Doesn't really help. For example, if I say, all right, if you come back to my classroom on Friday at this time at 11 o'clock and you're wearing a pink hat, if you do those things, I will give you 5 chocolates. Well, it doesn't help if I, as the promise giver, go and I get my 5 chocolates ready for you and I look at my watch and I go, okay, it's 5 to 11, or it's 11 o'clock. Oh, where are you? And you don't arrive. And you don't arrive, and then it becomes 12 o'clock and you never arrive. I, as the promise giver, still have my 5 chocolates ready for you, but you don't arrive. If you are the one that was given the promise, you made a choice and you chose not to walk in the promise and not come and actually get what was promised to you, then the promise didn't mean much, did it? So you see, when someone gives you a promise, you need to walk in it and you need to accept the promise and you need to, by faith, come and get what was delivered to you. But there's a process. You have to walk towards the time where the promise actually happens. So if you don't rock up at the classroom, then you can't get the 5 chocolates. There's your responsibility and there's the promise giver's responsibility. They've got to work together. Okay, so I'm going to explain that a little bit and why we have a responsibility in God's promises as well. And what that is that believing God is the part that we play. And God calls that faith. Isn't that awesome? So today's passage is from Genesis 15:6, and it's Abram. Abram believed the Lord. So he did his part. God said something to him, promised him, and he believed. So God made the promise. Abraham responded with one of 2 things, either belief or unbelief. He chose belief. And then it says, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. So when God made him a promise, Abraham believed, and that belief in who God was made him righteous because his faith was fully in God. Abraham obviously had an ability to just know that God's character could completely be trusted. He knew that when God gave him a promise that seemed almost impossible to fulfill, that it wasn't impossible for God because God isn't human, God doesn't lie, and God has incredible power to be able to fulfill his promises. So Abraham just knew. He obviously was a real man of faith. He knew and trusted in God's character, and he knew that because of who God was, that what he said matched his character, so he could trust him. And this trust God saw as faith in who he was, and so he was considered righteous. Now, the important thing about the story is that it was difficult. So God made an incredibly strange and profound promise to Abram. Most of you recognize or would recognize the name Abraham. But before his name was changed to Abraham, his name was Abram, and he was quite an old guy. Him and his wife Sarah had longed for children. They were wealthy. All they needed was children to be able to continue their life and to pass down their possessions one day when they died and to make sure that their family line continued. In those days, there weren't that many people on the planet, and they just wanted children. But God hadn't given them the ability to have children. And as they got older and older, it got more and more devastating for them. And eventually, I suppose, where you get to a certain point in your life where you give up. And anyway, they got on with their lives, but one day God rocked up in Abram's life and said, I'm going to give you a son. Not only am I going to give you a son, but this son is going to be the person that is going to have children and their children and their children and their children that line of people, that family, is going to be the family through whom I bless all the people on the planet. He didn't say it to them just then. They didn't understand. But through that child, eventually, one day, far down that line, is where Jesus would come from. And as we know, Jesus died to make sure that we can all become righteous through faith in him. So, Abram at the time, was given the most profound promise. But to him, as just an old man, the promise meant having a child and a son who could then take over everything and just become the next person in his line, somebody to bless, somebody to give all of his possessions to. Perhaps if he passed away, his child would be able to look after his wife until she passed away. It was really important in those days to have children so that they could care for you when you were old. It's not like today where there's lots of people on the planet and perhaps you can book into an old age home. Things were very different then. It was very important to have children. So when God came to him in his really old age and said, you're going to have a child, it must have been incredibly difficult for him to even grasp that this could happen. But because he believed in God's character, and though it was difficult at times to continue to believe, because God didn't fulfill that promise for 20 years, and he just kept on believing. And it's incredible that he did believe, but there was something in his spirit that recognized that God had spoken and that God can be trusted. And so this is so encouraging for us because God makes promises in Scripture, but sometimes our circumstances just don't add up to what God is saying he's going to do. And so we must remember that our part in God's promises is belief. When God says he's going to do something, even though it looks impossible, we need to believe. What's difficult for us, and it must have been very difficult for Abram, is that God's timing is very different to ours. Remember, he looks at the beginning and the end of time. We're somewhere, a little dot in between, and he can see, he could take 2 years to fulfill that promise, and in his mind, it's exactly at the right time. But in our minds, it can be very stressful waiting, because when we have a need and we're waiting for God to fulfill that need, it can feel very overwhelming. But you know what? Because God is all powerful and God is all wise, he can see when is the perfect timing. It often feels wrong to us, but when he fulfills his promises to us, suddenly we go, oh wow, this is why God waited so long. Because now I see his timing is perfect. It's so much better. I learned this, or I can now understand that. Or if you'd done this 3 months before, this would have happened. We don't always get that insight, but very often we do, and we see why God's timing in fulfilling his promise is always absolutely perfect. Sometimes we need a little help with our belief, though. Sometimes we struggle. And you know, there's a scripture in the New Testament where a man who struggled to believe what Jesus was doing actually said to Jesus, I believe, but help my unbelief. So he had a measure of faith. He believed, but he also struggled to believe. And he was clever enough to realize that he was struggling with belief because he believed what Jesus was doing, but he also struggled to believe that he really was God. He just was torn between those two things, right? And that's very, very much a part of our journey. Sometimes we really do believe what God has promised, and yet we struggle because our circumstances are just so tricky. So I want you to remember, when God has given us a promise, put your belief in the fact that his character, who he is, means he cannot lie, and he's working on his own timing to fulfill his promises to us. So I hope that encourages you today. If God has given you a promise, or your parents a promise, whatever it might be, God is always perfect in his timing, and he will fulfill his promises to us. So don't give up. But remember, your job is to believe. He can't do that for you. Okay, that's it for today. Have a fantastic day. Until next time, bye.